So far, when we talk about JSON, what we have been able to do is to get a JSON file and put in our project and then parse it that way. That works fine, but most of the times JSON, as we said before when we talked about JSON APIs, intention usually is to have an API, application programming interface. Essentially, it's just a way in which us developers can communicate to a web server, which will be serving us some data from a database somewhere. Okay, so usually it's in form of an API, application programming interface, that allows us to get that data, as opposed to having to rely on getting the actual hard code file and put in our projects, because that's just not always the case, and it shouldn't be. Okay, so how do we then parse data that it's coming from an API? Well, we're going to go ahead and create a new project. I kind of have a head start. I'm going to go ahead and say next. So I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call this parse J, just like that. Say next. And we know exactly where it's supposed to be. And voila, we should have a new project. Looks really good. So what is it that we're going to be parsing? Well, so there is this website called JSON Placeholder, as you can see here, where it gives us a very simple API. In fact, they call it a fake API. JSON Placeholder is a fake API that allows you to just play around with JSON. Now, there are different endpoints here. The first endpoint meaning a place where we can actually go and fetch JSON code. And you can come down here and you can see that there is an example. You can click try and it shows us the actual payload. Payload in this case is just the JSON data. Now I have to remind you that this should at this point remind you of Swift Dictionary, as we talked before, if you have been following us. So this will come in handy. Now, one thing to remember is that the way the root of our JSON is constructed is very important, because we will see later why is that so. What is the root? The root is always what initiates our API. What I mean by that is that, well, in this case, we know that the root is going to be a dictionary because we have these curly braces. So if we go back down here, we can see other endpoints of our API. For instance, if I go to comments, you notice right away we see that we have a different structure. So at this point here, you should see that we have what we call an array. Let's make this a little bit bigger, perhaps, so you can see. There we go. So you can see at the top here, we have a different structure. So these are brackets which symbolize an array. This means that our API now, the root, is indeed an array. So this array contains objects or dictionaries. In fact, we can close down like this and open them up. This will become more clear once we get to parsing and so forth. All right, so back to our JSON placeholder here. This is the endpoint that we're going to be using to parse, of course, this. Okay, so let's go ahead and copy that, the URL, because we're going to need that. And let's take us back to our Xcode. So we're going to go here and say right click. We want to create a new file. Let's create a Swift file there, and we're going to call this networking manager as such. All right, so we have it, and get rid of all of this stuff that we don't really need. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and create a class called networking manager. And this class here will have to conform to an observable object, because we want to make sure that we have listeners who will be listening to this networking manager. The moment that we get the data, all the listeners will be able to know, because they'll be listening, right, to this object here, that, hey, there is data, something is changed, and then we're going to go ahead and revamp our UI, or in this case, redraw our user interface with the new data. Okay, so the observable object. So I'm going to say observable. If I can type, of course, observable object as such. Close that one down there. And so here is where we're going to be doing the coding. Now, before we even go forward here, we need to go ahead and create a data list entry. So this data list entry, it's going to map our JSON API payload or object with an actual SwiftUI object. So what I mean by that, let's go ahead and create it real quick. So I'm going to call this, it's going to be a Swift file. And let's call this data list entry. Very good. You could call whatever you want, but it seems to be good, that name there. So I'm going to go ahead and paste in one of the example of the payload that we have I showed you earlier. So we have the user ID, we have the ID, title, and body. So this is what we're expecting to receive from our JSON API. So this model class we're going to create will have to map all of these properties so that we can then have those as Swift file. So here I'm going to say struct data list entry, and this is going to be decodable as well as identifiable. So I'm going to confirm to two different protocols here because we're going to need those in a little bit. Okay, let me close that one down like this. Okay, let's go ahead and close this down. Let's go ahead and add a few properties here. So I'm going to say var user ID. Notice these properties have to be exactly the same properties as we are expecting. Okay, so user ID is going to be an integer. Var ID is going to be also an integer. Var title is a string, and var body is also going to be a string. So essentially all of these 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, all right. Now that we have that, let's go back to our network manager here because we'll use our data list entry here to parse the data. Let's go ahead here. I'm going to say var data list. It's going to be expecting, of course, an array that will contain data list types. That makes sense. We're going to use this data type variable here, which we expect to be a data list entry to actually populate our data. But of course, we have to instantiate it here. So I'm going to go ahead and put something like that. Okay, so we're actually creating new empty array. We expect to actually have data list entry types. Now the thing here to notice is that because this data list here is going to be dealing with data that we're getting from our API, this is where we are making sure that this variable indeed can listen and publish, in this case actually, the events that happen. So meaning once we get the data and we populate this data list with the information from our API, we want to make sure that the SwiftUI knows how to publish this event to any other struct or view that needs this data. For that to happen, we have to say at and pass published. Just like that, this data list will be able to publish the data and all the changes that happen to this data to anybody else who is listening. Okay, so this is good way of data binding, if you will, so that the views are actually changing as data comes in. So if data changes, the views that are listening to our data list here or our network manager as an observable object, they will know to update their user interface with the new data. Okay, so let's go ahead and do the actual coding. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to create an init initializer here, and I'm not going to pass anything inside, but I'm going to start this variable as a guard let URL. So anytime you are dealing with URLs, we need to make sure that our URL is actually guarded, if you will, just in case if things go wrong. So I'm going to say is equal to URL. I'm going to make sure that the URL is actually valid. I'm going to pass it as a string here, and the URL we are going to be hitting, and the endpoint of our API we're going to be getting is here HTTPS JSON placeholder, okay, typecode.com posts. All right, that's where we are getting everything. In fact, if I go again to this link here, you can see this is what we are going to be getting. Right. All right, so if this goes wrong, meaning if this URL for some reason is wrong or something didn't go right, I'm going to go ahead and pass an else here and just say return like that. So if anything goes wrong, we're just going to ignore everything and move on to the next statement. So next I'm going to say URL session as such, and I'm going to invoke the shared singleton in this case here. I'm going to invoke the data task with URL. So I'm going to pass the URL that we have there. So this here will actually allow us to do all of the backend parsing, getting stuff. So this here, what we're doing, we are putting everything in the backend, not in the main thread. So we can go ahead and hit this URL here API and start the process of extracting information from it. So then we're going to be expecting a few things from our data task. So the first one is data, which will contain the payload, the JSON per se, in a different format. And then we're going to ignore anything else with underscores like that. I'm going to say in This is some closures. And then I'm going to say guard again, just to protect ourselves. Let data that we're receiving, say data, else if something goes wrong again, I'm going to just say return like that. Okay. So in this case here, we're going to make sure that if data is actually something usable, of course, we're going to put inside of this variable here, else let's just move on. So now that we have that data, I'm going to say let data list. Okay. I'm going to make it a try here just in case things don't go right. And then I'm going to invoke the JSON decoder. Okay, because we need to decode whatever we're getting into something that makes sense for SwiftUI. So JSON decoder, I'm going to invoke the decode method. Notice for the decode method, we have to pass the actual type that we want to use to decode. Because remember, what we're trying to do is to map our JSON payload, the object we are getting, with this data list entry. That's why we need to pass some sort of the type that we want to map with. In this case here, the type we want to map it with is going to be, of course, an array that will contain data list entry. It has to be exactly the same thing as we did here. Okay? Well, from what? It's going to be from our data, which is this one that we're passing. There's extra spaces there. Now, to finalize this, we have to say .self, right? To say we want actually to go and get the data type, not the object itself. Very good. So once we have that, we're going to say dispatch queue. Now, the dispatch queue here allows us to manage the execution of our task, right? It could be serially or concurrently in our app's main thread or in a background thread. So I'm going to use that for our advantage because we want to make sure that everything happens in the back. And I'm going to go to main. Async, because I want to make sure that this happens asynchronously. I'm going to pass the first one, closure there. And then in this case here, once we have our data, we're going to populate our data list. Okay, that's the idea, because now we have the actual data list that we created here, which contains everything mapped out for us to start using in our code. The data, that is. So I'm going to say self.data list, meaning this guy here, which is a published, right? And I'm going to just add what I have to it. It's going to be equal to data list, which is data list is this one. Because at this point here, this data list has the actual JSON, which we decoded to look like an actual Swift object, which we can then go and fetch all of the properties. Okay. And before we forget, we actually have to invoke the resume method, which resumes the task if, God forbid, if it's suspended. Okay, and here inside here, we can do all sort of things. I'm going to just go ahead and print for now our self.data list, which is this guy here, which of course should have all the payload, meaning, again, should have all of this. Okay, very good. So if we go ahead and run right now, of course, nothing is going to happen because we haven't actually invoked this networking manager, which we're going to be doing in the next video. So everything should at least work for now. And in the next video, we are going to see how to invoke this network manager inside of our content view so we can hopefully see something.